Let's go ahead and figure out where we went wrong. To do that, we're going to have a look at our code. But for example, I can't see whether or not it's an issue with a top section or a mid section. So let's go ahead and visualize it a bit better. Let's go up to our buildings node. And let's just grab all of these and copy them. So then we're going to go back into our Skyline node and move this one over. Let's drop down a subnet. And that's where we're going to plug them in. Control V them and wait for them to be dropped down. So now we have the same network in here. What we can do now is put down a switch. And while we're pulling in the bounding boxes on this side, what we can do is pull in the full resolution buildings on this side, but currently they're still set to bounding box. First, let's plug this in and switch those around. So left is going to be the high res, and on the right side is going to be the low res. What we could do with this one is bypass the bounding box nodes, and then we'll get to see the high res versions. But because we use the bounding boxes to measure height, if we would disable them, we would break the calculations that stack the buildings for us, because it would no longer be able to calculate the height of each segment. That's why I'm doing it this way. Now what we want to do is, in this node, we want to bypass those bounding box nodes, but you can see there's quite a lot of them, and since this is only a course, it's actually not that many. If you'd be doing this in a production setting, you might have, I don't know, 10 times the amount of these buildings. And here's just another excuse to teach us a bit of Python. Let's go to the Windows menu, to the Python source editor, and write out some code. First, the thing with the source editor is the who module is not always necessarily imported for us, so let's begin with this. Import who, that gives us access to that module. So what we want to do is we want to identify all the bounding box nodes inside the subnet. It's called subnet 1 in this case. Let's go and fetch the children of the subnet 1 node. Let's call it nodes. Nodes is who.node, open and close quotation marks, obj/skyline. That's the path you can see on the bottom right window. And then inside Skyline, we want to have subnet 1. And from that, we're going to get the children. And children with opening and closing brackets is a function that comes with the who module. So now, for node in nodes, finish with a colon, 4 spaces, indent, if, and then in between quotation marks, bound in node.name. So now we're checking if bound as a text is in the name of the node. And again, the name function here will retrieve the names of each node. Finish with a colon, 4 spaces, indentation, node.bypass. And bypass is another function that we can open and close with brackets at the end. And then in between there, it's a Boolean. So it's either 0, which is false, or 1, which is true. So if we now find all the bound nodes, let's first do that. Let's make sure we found them all correctly. Print node.name. Let's apply that. And that should print them all to our terminal. So now we can see that we have all the bound nodes that are inside. So we know we've got that right. And now we can bypass them. So we do node.bypass 1. Now if we do this, before we click accept, just double click this node so we can be inside it. And if we hit apply, we should see that they are now all automatically bypassed. If you would set this back to 0, that would turn that off again. So this is an easy way to toggle. And you could, of course, make this into a menu button, for example, if you use this function a lot. In our case, we won't. So make sure that it's set to bypass 1 and that these are all colored yellow. Hit apply and accept. So now you can see in the viewport that we have our high-res buildings. And if we now switch our switch node to 0, which it already is, then this line becomes dotted and this line is thick, which means we're getting the feed from the left input. All right, make sure you save your Houdini scene, because we're now going to visualize all these buildings on our actual point cloud, and that might be a bit tougher. I'm going to zoom out so we can see a bit more what's going on. Might be slightly heavy, but it should be fine since we're all packing the geometry. All right, here we go. So we can see that we have entire top sections missing. So there's definitely an issue there. At least now we know where in the code to look. So we're going to have a look at our top section part of the code. Let's find our Python Skyline node right there. Looking at our network before we go inside, let's just give it a color. Let's color it I don't know, it doesn't really matter, blue, so that next time we can easily find it. Now I'm going to expand the window for you. And if we have a look over our code, we remember that we set up all the stuff at the top. So all our attributes are being pulled in. And then there we got a while loop right there in which we start defining what points to put down and how to format those. So I can already see we've made a mistake here. We have while, and then there's an if and an elif statement inside. But against the while, there should be an else statement, which is here. The problem with this else statement is, however, that it is in the same line as elif and the if statement, whereas it should be mirroring the while loop. So now if we click the whole block, we should be able to unindent it by pressing Shift Tab, and that will pull it back one step. And now it is while this is true, do these two blocks up here. So these two blocks. And when while is no longer true, you jump to this block. Before that wouldn't happen. Let's hit apply and keep an eye on our buildings in the viewport here and see what happens to them. It's going to take a second. So now we see that we do have buildings being topped off, but they're still floating, so there must be another issue somewhere. So let's have a look at our code. Well, there are only a few changes that we make in every block. So we have total height plus mid-segment height. Then we have total height plus mid-segment height. We have stacking mid-segment height on top of the Y position. In the first block, we want the building height to be stacked on top, so that should be all right. Let's look at the top section again. Yeah, there we go. So because we copy-pasted this from the first code block, we forgot to change building height into mid-segment height because we want the top section to sit on top of mid-section. Let's change this to mid-segment height. Hit apply. And give it a second to cook. Boom, there we go. It looks like our buildings are now complete, and we have fixed the issues in the code that we had. In the next clip, let's have a closer look at what we have.